The train had not even finished grinding to a halt when Ada Maddox heard them talking about her. She sat rigid in the hard wooden seat, her traveling bag clutched against her chest like armor, listening to the two women behind her exchange whispers sharp enough to cut through the shriek of breaking iron. She did not need to turn around to know the shape of their judgment. She had worn that shape for 3 weeks now, ever since the night her father had pressed a one-way ticket to Harlow Creek, Texas into her palm and told her she was no longer welcome under his roof. "Sent away," one of the women murmured, and Ada felt the words land against the back of her neck like a brand. "You can always tell, can't you? The way they carry themselves, like they know they deserve the shame." Ada's jaw tightened. She stared through the grimy window at the landscape bleeding past flat, sun-scorched Texas scrubland unrolling in every direction, broken only by the occasional stunted mesquite and the brutal blue immensity of the October sky. The year was 1879, and she was 23 years old, and everything she had ever known had been reduced to the contents of a single carpet bag. Her father was Gerald Maddox of Caldwell, Kansas, the finest gunsmith between the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, or so every person in Caldwell County had believed for 20 years. Gerald Maddox, whose shop windows gleamed, whose reputation stretched 100 miles in every direction, whose word was iron, and whose daughter, 3 weeks ago, had stood in his back workshop and accidentally discovered something that made all of that reputation into a lie so monstrous she still could not fully breathe when she thought about it. She had not told anyone. She had no one to tell. Gerald had sent her away instead before she could. The train lurched to its final stop, and the conductor called out, "Harlow Creek," in a voice that suggested he considered it barely worth the breath. Ada stood, steadied herself against the rocking car, and joined the small trickle of passengers filing toward the door. The two women behind her fell silent as she passed, which was somehow worse than the whispering. She descended the iron steps onto a platform of weathered planking and stopped. Harlow Creek, Texas announced itself with a water tower, a feed store, and approximately 12 people standing in the October dust. It smelled of horse, heated pine, and something sweet she could not name. The sky above it was so wide it felt like an accusation. She had been sent here, according to her father's arrangements, as a housekeeper for a rancher named Wesley Keating, who had corresponded with Gerald through a mutual acquaintance. The word housekeeper was doing considerable labor in that arrangement. Ada understood perfectly well what it meant to be a woman sent away with her usefulness as her only currency. She lifted her chin anyway. She scanned the platform, looking for whoever had been sent to collect her. One man stood apart from the small, dispersing crowd. He was tall, with the kind of unhurried stillness that comes not from laziness, but from some deep interior economy of movement. His hat was dark with honest sweat at the band, his duster coat the color of old wheat. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe slightly more, with a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something angular and quiet. He was not looking at her with the calculating assessment she had expected. He was looking at her with an expression that was harder to name, something cautious, something careful, something that looked almost like the particular attention a man pays when he is trying very hard not to presume. He held a piece of paper in one hand. She could see her own name written on it from 8 feet away. Ada Maddox. She walked toward him with every atom of dignity she possessed. "Wesley Keating," she said. "Miss Maddox." He removed his hat. His voice was low and unhurried, the way the land around them was unhurried, the way everything out here seemed to operate on a schedule that had nothing to do with urgency. "I hope the journey wasn't too hard." She looked at him for a moment. Something in his directness, in the complete absence of any smirk or pity or prurient interest, loosened the tightest knot in her chest by exactly 1 degree. "It was fine," she said. "Thank you for coming." He nodded, reached for her bag, and she let him take it, not because she was helpless. Because somewhere in the way he held out his hand, she understood he was not trying to take anything from her. He was simply offering to carry something heavy for a moment. She had not had that in a very long time. That was how it began. The ride from the station to Wesley Keating's ranch took the better part of an hour in his buckboard wagon, following a rutted track that cut northeast across land that was vast and quiet and beautifully indifferent. Ada sat beside him on the wagon bench, and they did not speak much, but the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words, at this particular moment, would not improve on the simple fact of presence. Wesley had arranged with Ada Maddox through their mutual acquaintance, a dry goods merchant named Harlan Briggs who had since moved from Caldwell to San Antonio, for Ada to come and keep his house. The arrangement had been framed as employment. Ada's father had framed it, in the single letter he had written to accompany her, as a placement for a young woman requiring a fresh start in a new territory. Ada had read her father's letter, fresh start. Those two words had cost her 3 nights' sleep on the train and would cost her several more, she suspected. She looked at Wesley from the corner of her eye. He held the reins with the relaxed authority of a man who had spent more hours behind a team of horses than behind a desk, and he watched the road with that same unhurried attention. He did not appear to be performing anything. He did not appear to be concealing anything either, and Ada, who had spent the last 3 weeks in the raw shock of discovering what a man could conceal behind a perfectly maintained surface, found that specific quality more striking than any amount of good looks. He was, she noticed, also not bad looking. That was a separate and entirely inconvenient observation, and she filed it away immediately. "You're spread," she said to say something. "How large is it?" "About 4,000 acres," he said. "Mostly grazing. I run Hereford cattle, some horses." "Do you have other staff?" "3 hands, Clem, who's been with me longest, and 2 younger men, Robert and Francisco. They're good men." He paused. "There's also a cook who comes in 3 days a week from town, widow by the name of Patsy Greer. She'll show you how the kitchen runs." Ada absorbed this. "You don't need a full-time cook, then." "I need someone who can run the house," he said, and there was nothing evasive about it. "And who isn't going to leave after a month because Harlow Creek doesn't suit them. I went through 2 hired girls in the last year. Neither one lasted." "Why not?" He glanced at her sideways. There was something almost like humor in it, though he didn't quite smile. "One decided she preferred life in San Antonio. The other one married Clem." Ada blinked. "She married your ranch hand." "He's a good man," Wesley said, with a simplicity that seemed to genuinely contain the whole of his reasoning. She was a sensible woman. Ada looked back at the road ahead. The flat land was beginning to show low hills in the distance, and she could see where the scrub gathered thicker along the line of a dry creek bed. It was a hard country, but there was something honest about its hardness. It didn't pretend to be anything else. "I should tell you," she said, because she had decided on the train that she would not begin whatever this was by pretending, "that my father's letter probably makes my situation sound tidier than it is." Wesley waited. "I left Caldwell under difficult circumstances," Ada said. "People there know it. People on that train knew it somehow, which means word travels. I'm not going to pretend I have a spotless reputation coming into your household, because you'll find out anyway, and I'd rather you hear it directly from me than through rumor." He was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves thudded softly in the dust. "Miss Maddox," he said at last, "I didn't come to that station expecting perfection. I came expecting a person." She turned to look at him fully then, and he was looking at the road, and the afternoon light was laying itself across his profile with complete indifference to the fact that it was doing something quite unfair to his expression. "You're either very generous," she said, "or you're not asking because you don't want to know." "I'm not asking," he said, "because you just told me what matters. You said you'd rather I hear it directly. That tells me enough for now." Ada did not know what to do with that, so she looked at the road again and let it be. The Keating ranch house was a plain, well-built structure of Texas limestone and timber, 2 stories, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and southern side. It was not a grand house, but it was a serious one, the kind of place built to last rather than to impress. Someone, at some point, had planted a row of cottonwood trees along the eastern face, and they had grown tall enough to throw significant shade across the afternoon side of the building. Inside the porch, a pair of old wooden chairs sat angled toward each other as if in mid-conversation. Ada stepped down from the wagon and looked at it for a long moment. She had grown up in a gunsmith shop in Caldwell, Kansas. Her earliest memories were of the smell of gun oil and steel filings, of the sound of her father's voice instructing customers in the particular needs of their weapons, of the gleam of finished stocks and polished barrels arranged in the window display. It had been a prosperous life, a respected life, a life she had not fully appreciated until it had been taken from her in a single horrifying evening. She pulled her attention back to the present. "It's a good house," she said. "It does what a house is supposed to do," Wesley said, which seemed to be the entire extent of his architectural opinion. He showed her the kitchen first, which was large and well-equipped by frontier standards. An iron cookstove, a dry sink with a pump handle that drew from the cistern, a proper work table, good deep shelving. Then the parlor, plain and functional, with a stone fireplace and a single bookshelf that she noticed with some surprise, held 20 or 30 actual books. Then the small room off the kitchen that would be hers, a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked east toward the cottonwoods. "I had Patsy make it up fresh," he said from the doorway. "It's more than sufficient," Ada said. "Thank you," he nodded, started to go, then stopped. "There's supper on the stove. Patsy left a pot of beans and some cornbread. Help yourself whenever you're ready." "Mr. Keating," he paused. "Why did you take on this arrangement?" she asked. "My father's letter couldn't have been all that reassuring." He considered the question with the same unhurried attention he seemed to apply to everything. "Because Harlan Briggs told me that Gerald Maddox's daughter was smart and capable and had been badly done by," he said. "And because I've had enough experience with judgment to know it isn't always honest." Then he left her to settle in, and Ada stood in her small room in the fading October light and realized that for the first time in 3 weeks, she did not feel like a thing being discarded. That feeling was fragile and new, and she did not trust it yet. But she kept it anyway, the way you keep a coal against the cold, carefully, with both hands. She slept that night better than she had slept since Caldwell. In the weeks that followed, Ada found the rhythm of the ranch slowly. Patsy Greer arrived Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings, a brisk, warm woman of about 50 with flour permanently in her hair and an opinion about everything, delivered with the cheerful authority of someone who has decided that life is too short for tact. She showed Ada the kitchen's particular logic, where the stores were kept, what Wesley preferred for supper, the precise idiosyncrasies of the stove's hot spots. "He's a quiet man," Patsy told Ada on her second visit, kneading bread dough with the focused power of a person who had done it 10,000 times. "But not the kind of quiet that means he's hiding something, just the kind that means he's thinking." "What does he think about?" Ada asked, genuinely curious. Patsy smiled. "The ranch, his cattle, whether the winter will be hard." She paused, gave Ada a sideways look. "He used to think about his wife, but she's been gone 4 years now." Ada had not known about a wife. She absorbed this carefully. "What happened?" "Fever," Patsy said simply. "The summer of '75, she was a good woman, Clara was. We was different after. Not broken, he's not a man who breaks, but quieter. More careful about what he lets himself want." Ada thought about that for a long time after Patsy left. She met the ranch hands that first week. Clem was broad, gray-haired, and nearly wordless. A man who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat and a set of expressive silences. Robert was 20, energetic, and inclined to tell Ada long and winding stories about his mother's cooking in a way that suggested he was homesick and managing it badly. Francisco was 26, calm and precise, a vaquero from Coahuila who had been working the Texas ranges since he was 15 and who, once he decided Ada was acceptable, nodded at her every morning with the gravity of a general acknowledging a trusted officer. They were, as Wesley had said, good men. Ada found that she believed him. The work was substantial but not impossible. A ranch house of this size required constant management, the ceaseless cycle of cleaning and cooking and preserving and mending that was the backbone of any frontier household. Ada was not afraid of work. She had kept her father's house since her mother died when she was 12, and that had been harder in every way because her father had been exacting in his expectations and had never once said thank you. She caught herself, one cold November morning, standing at the kitchen window watching the men work in the yard below, and she realized she had been humming. She did not know when she had last done that. Ada and Wesley found their conversation slowly, the way you find your footing on new ground, one careful step at a time, testing the surface before committing weight. He ate supper with her most evenings, which she had not entirely expected. He was not the kind of employer who maintained elaborate distance, but he was also not the kind who overstepped. He sat across the table from her and they talked about the ranch, about the weather, about the books on his shelf. She had started borrowing them, one by one, about the small news that filtered into Harlow Creek from the wider world. One evening she was returning a copy of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and she pulled the next book from the shelf without looking carefully enough, and it turned out to be a collection of poetry. She started to put it back, and he said from across the room where he was cleaning a bridle, "That was my wife's." Ada held very still. "You can read it," he said. She'd have wanted the books used. Ada sat down in the chair closest to the lamp and opened it. Some of the pages had notes in the margins in a small, slanted handwriting. After a moment she looked up and said, she annotated it. "Clara had opinions about poetry," he said. "What kind of opinions?" Something shifted in his expression, and she could see the shape of an old grief there, not sharp anymore, but present the way a healed scar is present, changed in the landscape but permanent. "The opinionated kind," he said, and smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it did something unexpected to the room. She looked back at the book. After a moment she read aloud one of Clara's margin notes. "This poet has never had cold feet in winter, and it shows." Wesley made a sound that was absolutely a laugh, short and surprised, and Ada looked up and they both stayed in that laughter for a moment. And something shifted between them that neither of them acknowledged because it was too new and too significant for acknowledgement just yet. December came, and with it, the cold that swept down from the north in proper earnest. Ada baked and preserved and kept the fires, and Wesley brought in extra wood without being asked, stacking it under the porch cover against the coming hard nights. They established a Sunday habit of reading in the parlor after supper, each with a book, the fire going, the silence between them companionable in a way that Ada was beginning to treasure with a specific and somewhat alarming intensity. She was being careful. She was keeping everything in its proper place. She had arrived here under the shadow of her father's disgrace, and she had no intention of adding to it by letting her feelings run away with her before she understood what she was feeling and why. The trouble was, understanding it seemed to be coming in faster than she could manage. One evening she was in the kitchen when she heard horses outside, more than one, and a voice she did not recognize, loud and with an edge to it. She went to the window and saw 3 men on horseback, and Wesley standing in the yard, perfectly still in the way he was still when something required his full attention. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the geometry of the situation. The men on horseback were not friends. She watched Wesley until the men rode away, and then she went back to the stove and was stirring the pot when he came in, stomping the cold from his boots. "Trouble?" she asked. "Neighbors," he said, in a tone that packed a good deal of information into the word. He sat down at the kitchen table and rubbed the back of his neck. "The Danforth brothers. They've been pushing against the east fence for 2 years. Think I'm running cattle on land that should be theirs. Should it be?" "No," he said without heat. "I have the deed and the survey, but they're not the kind of men who let legal reality interfere with what they've decided they want." Ada set a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked at it, then at her, with an expression that said he noticed and was grateful and was not going to make it uncomfortable by saying too much about it. "Is it dangerous?" she asked. "Could get that way," he admitted. "I'd rather it didn't. I have a lawyer in San Antonio who's handling the formal dispute, but the Danforths are impatient men." Ada sat down across from him. "Tell me about them." He gave her a look that was part surprise, part something warmer. Most people, she suspected, when he said things like this, either changed the subject to avoid conflict or offered bluster and advice. She was asking him to tell her the actual situation so she could understand it. He told her. The Danforth brothers, Holt and Roy, ran a cattle operation 2 miles east. They had come to Harlow Creek 3 years ago with money and ambition, and a history in the New Mexico territories that no one had examined too closely. They had been pressing Wesley's eastern boundary since their first year, claiming that the original land grant was in dispute, which it was not. The previous autumn, someone had cut a section of Wesley's fence and run off 14 head of cattle. He couldn't prove it was the Danforths. His lawyer was building a case. "And the law in Harlow Creek?" Ada asked. "Sheriff Drummond is an honest man," Wesley said, "but he's one man and he can't be everywhere." Ada nodded slowly. She was thinking, and he seemed to know she was thinking and did not hurry her. "I grew up around men who used legal means and illegal means simultaneously," she said at last. "My father—" She stopped. Wesley waited. She made the decision. "My father had a beautiful reputation in Caldwell, best gunsmith in the territory. Fair prices, excellent work, absolute trustworthiness." She paused, looking at the surface of the table. 3 weeks before he sent me away, I was working late in his back workshop. I helped with the books, the records, and I found a second set of them." Wesley was very still. "He had been selling modified rifles," Ada said. "Not to ordinary customers, to specific men. Men who came after dark. The modifications he was making, I didn't know enough about firearms to understand exactly what they meant, but I understood enough to know they were illegal. And that some of those rifles had been linked, in newspaper reports I'd read, to 2 ambushes on U.S. Army supply wagons in the Indian Territory." The room was very quiet. "He saw me," Ada said. "He knew I'd seen the records. He told me I was confused, that I'd misunderstood, that I was overwrought. Then he arranged for me to be sent here within a week." She looked up. "He didn't ask me to keep quiet. He didn't have to. I was 23 and I had nowhere to go, and everyone in Caldwell thought the world of Ada Maddox. Who was going to believe me?" Wesley was watching her with that careful, full attention she had come to recognize as his most serious mode of presence. "I believed you," he said. "From everything you just said. You weren't there. No, but you're not a woman who makes things up and then sends herself away to live in a stranger's house in Texas for the privilege of it." He paused. "What do you want to do about it?" Ada blinked. "I beg your pardon. I'm asking what you want to do," he said. "Not what you're afraid of, not what you think you can't do. What do you actually want?" She had not been asked that, not once. Not by her father, not by anyone in Caldwell, not by the women on the train or the empty horizon she'd been staring at for 3 weeks. "I want it to stop," she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "I want him to stop. People were killed, Mr. Keating, soldiers probably, and he's still there behind his shining window with his perfect reputation, and he sent his own daughter away like a piece of evidence he needed to get rid of." "Then we figure out how to stop it," Wesley said. "We," she repeated. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said. "If you'll let me help." The fire crackled. Outside the window, the December wind was pressing against the panes. Ada looked at this man, this quiet rancher with his honest hands and his dead wife's poetry and his careful attention, and felt something in her chest that was significant and terrifying and absolutely real. "I need to think," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and stood up and cleared his own cup from the table, the way a man does when he is not performing consideration but simply practicing it, and went to check on the horses before bed. Ada sat at the table for a long time. The question of her father's crimes and what to do about them had been lodged in her chest like a splinter for 3 weeks. impossible to ignore and too deep to simply pull out. She had turned it over from every angle on that train, running through every scenario, every consequence, every argument against action. The arguments against were not nothing. Gerald Maddox was her father. He had raised her alone after her mother died. He had, for most of her childhood, been the most reliable thing in her world. The idea of being the instrument of his destruction was not simple or clean, even now. But the dead soldiers were also not nothing. She spent a week thinking about it, and at the end of that week she sat down with Wesley at the kitchen table after supper and told him what she had decided. "I have the records," she said. He looked up. "I took copies," she said, "the night I found them. I didn't know why at the time, instinct, I suppose. I folded them inside the lining of my traveling bag." Wesley looked at her bag, sitting by the door where it always sat, and then looked back at her. "They're in code," she said. "My father's system, but I know the system because I kept the public books for 3 years. I can translate them." "Who do we take them to?" he asked. "The U.S. Marshal's office," she said. "Not the local sheriff, this goes beyond local. There's a federal marshal in San Antonio. If your lawyer can make an introduction, Jacobson can do that," Wesley said immediately. "He knows the federal office in San Antonio. We were going to be in San Antonio in January for the deed filing anyway." "January is 6 weeks away," Ada said. "Are you safe in the meantime?" She thought about it honestly. "My father doesn't know where I am specifically. He knows I was sent to Harlow Creek, but not which ranch, and Harlan Briggs moved to San Antonio months ago. He has no reason to come looking for me. He thinks he's gotten rid of the problem." Wesley's expression did something complicated at the phrase "gotten rid of the problem," but he didn't pursue it. He said, "We keep the documents somewhere besides your bag, somewhere secure on the property." "The documents stay with me," she said firmly. He met her eyes. "All right." That was all. He did not argue. He did not tell her she was being unreasonable. He did not suggest he knew better. He simply accepted her judgment about her own situation and moved on to logistics. Ada thought about Patsy's description of him. Not a man who breaks, but quieter, more careful about what he lets himself want. She was beginning to understand what Patsy meant, and the understanding was doing nothing to help the problem she was carefully not naming. Christmas came to the Keating ranch with a quiet gentleness that surprised Ada. She had not been sure what to expect. Wesley seemed the kind of man who might regard holidays with the same pragmatic efficiency he applied to everything else. Instead, she came downstairs on Christmas morning to find that he had cut and set up a small cedar tree in the parlor, decorated with strips of colored cloth and a string of dried rosebuds that she suspected had come from some private store she hadn't found yet. On the kitchen table was a wrapped package. She stood and stared at it. "It's just a thing from town," Wesley said from the doorway, in the tone of a man who has done something that means more than he's letting on and has decided he would rather be flustered about it than not. "Patsy helped me choose it." Ada opened it carefully. Inside the brown paper was a small, beautifully bound copy of the collected poems of Walt Whitman, new and unread and entirely, specifically right for her in a way she could not account for him knowing. She looked up at him. "You mentioned once you'd never read Song of Myself properly," he said, and there was a slight color at the angle of his jaw that she had never seen before. "I thought you remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said, and then seemed to hear what he'd just admitted and looked at the ceiling for a moment as if it might offer assistance. Ada set the book down carefully on the table and took a breath and said, "Thank you, Wesley." It was the first time she had used his given name. Something happened to his face. The careful, guarded quality of his expression shifted, just briefly, into something more open, something that looked like the face behind the face, and it was not a complicated face at all. It was simply a man who had been very careful for a long time and had just had one careful layer peeled back by something he hadn't expected. "Thank you for Christmas breakfast," he said, because she had been up since 5 making proper biscuits and preserves and a baked ham from the smokehouse, and they had both been pretending the effort was ordinary. "It's not much," she said. "It's more than this house has had in 4 years," he said simply, and went out to do his morning chores before she could see what that cost him to say. Ada stood in the kitchen with her Whitman and the smell of ham and the cedar tree visible through the doorway, and acknowledged to herself with perfect clarity that she was in serious trouble. She was in love with Wesley Keating. She had not meant to be. She had arrived here as a woman in disgrace, with nothing but her competence and her secrets, and a determination not to be crushed by either. She had not intended anything of the kind. But here it was, fully formed and entirely inconvenient, sitting in her chest with the solidity of something that had been growing for weeks without permission. She was also carrying the documentation to destroy her father's reputation and potentially send him to prison. She was living in a house that the Danforth brothers seemed to regard as a permanent grievance, and she was technically an employee of the man she was in love with, which meant she had approximately no safe ground to stand on in any direction. She put the Whitman on her shelf and went back to the ham. January came, and the trip to San Antonio was arranged. Wesley drove the wagon as far as the stage junction 20 miles south, and from there Ada and Wesley traveled by coach, a proper Concord coach on the main line, considerably more comfortable than the train from Caldwell had been. Francisco stayed on the ranch with Clem and Robert. Wesley had arranged 2 separate rooms at a reputable hotel on Commerce Street. He was, Ada had come to understand, a man of complete scrupulousness when it came to her position and reputation, not because he was indifferent but because he was the opposite. He was aware that a woman who had already been sent away in shame could not afford to give anyone additional ammunition, and he was quietly, consistently determined to give no one any. This awareness, she had decided, was one of the most intimate things about him. The meeting with Marshal David Reardon of the San Antonio Federal Marshal's office took place on the second morning, in a plain office on the 3rd floor of a government building near the river. Reardon was a compact, watchful man of 50, who had the particular quality of stillness that comes from decades of evaluating people for a living. He sat across the table from Ada and read through the documents she had translated and laid out in sequence, and when he looked up his expression told her everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "These are genuine," he said. It was not a question. "They are," Ada said. "I kept those books for 3 years. I know my father's coding system because I developed half of it." Reardon looked at Wesley, who was seated slightly to Ada's left in the posture of a man who is present as support rather than authority. It was, Ada thought, a precise piece of physical positioning. He was there, visible, a stable presence, but he was not making himself the center of the room. This was her testimony, he knew that. "My father sent me away when he realized I'd found this," Ada said. "I believe the intent was to remove a witness who might contradict him." Reardon tapped the documents. "Miss Maddox, if these records are what you say they are, your father has been provisioning armed raids against federal supply operations. That's not a small matter." "I know," she said. "I'm also aware that he is my father and that this action has consequences for me as well as for him. I'm not asking for his destruction. I am asking for the raids to stop." Reardon studied her for a long moment. "You understand that when this goes to investigation, the people your father has been selling to will know the source of the intelligence." "I understand," Ada said. "I've thought about that. Are you somewhere safe?" She did not look at Wesley. She said yes. Reardon accepted the documents for federal use, issued Ada a formal receipt and a written statement of protection as a cooperating witness in a federal investigation, and shook her hand with the gravity of a man who had met courage in many forms and respected it consistently. On the way out of the building, on the broad stone steps in the January San Antonio sunlight, Ada stopped and had to breathe for a moment, because everything she had been carrying since October was still in her chest but was now outside of her as well, and the adjustment required some air. Wesley stood beside her on the steps and did not say anything because he understood the weight of what had just happened. He simply waited. After a while he said, "Jacobson's office is 3 blocks that direction if you want to handle the deed matter now." "Yes," she said, "let's do that." They did. And then Wesley took her to a proper restaurant on the River Walk and ordered her a meal that was entirely too good for a working lunch and didn't apologize for it. And they sat by the window and watched San Antonio conduct its afternoon business and talked about everything except the things that mattered most, in the companionable way of two people who are circling something important and know they will have to arrive at it eventually. "After this is over," Ada said over coffee, "the investigation and everything, I should probably find my own situation, proper employment or a position somewhere." Wesley looked at his cup. "Is that what you want?" "It's what would make sense," she said carefully. "I've been in your house under a particular arrangement, and that arrangement was made by your father," Wesley said, "and my assumption about it may have been different from your father's intention." She looked at him. "When Harlan Briggs wrote to me about this," Wesley said, in the tone of a man who is choosing his words with significant care, "he told me Gerald Maddox had a daughter who needed a placement. I asked what kind of placement, and Harlan said the permanent kind. I understood that to mean he stopped. I should have been clearer from the start. I thought you knew." Ada was very still. "I was told I was being hired as a housekeeper." "Your father told Harlan it was a housekeeper arrangement," Wesley said. "Harlan told me it was a marriage arrangement. The restaurant was conducting its ordinary business around them with complete indifference." "A marriage arrangement," Ada repeated. "I apologize," Wesley said, and he looked genuinely distressed. "I should have said something from the beginning. But you arrived and it was clear you didn't, that you didn't know that was the intent, and I didn't want to put pressure on you in an already difficult. You've been treating me as a potential wife this whole time," Ada said slowly. "I've been treating you as a person," he said, with some intensity. "What you might become to me beyond that was something I was prepared to leave entirely in your hands." Ada looked at him. She had never in her adult life been looked at by a man the way Wesley Keating looked at her, with complete respect for her autonomy, sitting right alongside something that was clearly and unmistakably more than respect. Both things at once, without either one canceling the other. "I need a moment," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, again, as he always said. She looked out the window at the river. She thought about her father's house and the lie it had been built on. She thought about the train and the whispering women. She thought about the cedar tree at Christmas and the Whitman and the sound of Wesley's surprised laugh in the parlor over Clara's margin note. She thought about what it meant that she had told him about the documents before she had told anyone else. What it meant that she had accepted his help not because she was desperate but because she trusted him. "I was not sent here wanting this," she said carefully. "I want you to know that. I was sent here wanting to survive and keep my dignity and not be defined by something my father did." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and felt the word open in front of her like a door. "What has happened since I arrived has been—" She stopped, started again. "You are not what I expected, Wesley." "What did you expect?" he asked quietly. "Someone who wanted a servant he could call a wife," she said honestly. "Or someone who wanted the appearance of a respectable household and didn't care about what was inside it." She looked at him. "You have cared consistently about what is inside it, about what is inside me. And I find that She stopped. He was watching her with absolute stillness, the way the land around his ranch was still, not empty but present, waiting, full. "I find that I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, because I want to be here." The very quiet that happened after she said that was a different kind of quiet than any of the others. It was the kind that precedes something irreversible, and they were both aware of it. "Ada," he said, and in his voice was everything he had been keeping careful for months. "Yes," she said. "Would you consider—" He stopped and reconsidered and then said more simply, "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, and then they both sat there in the San Antonio restaurant in January of 1880 with their coffee going cold between them, and Wesley reached across the table and took her hand, and Ada looked at his hand holding hers and thought, there it is. That is the thing. That is the whole of it. They were married in Harlow Creek in March of 1880, on a Thursday afternoon in the small white Methodist church on 2nd Street, in front of the Reverend Horace Cole and approximately 30 townspeople. Patsy Greer in the front pew, weeping with a kind of enthusiastic joy that suggested she had been hoping for this outcome since approximately October. Ada wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool broadcloth that she'd purchased in San Antonio, and she wore her mother's cameo brooch, which was the one personal item of value she'd carried in the carpet bag from Caldwell. Wesley wore his best suit and a clean hat, and looked exactly as nervous and exactly as certain as he was, which was to say very much of both. And when Reverend Cole asked if he would take Ada Maddox to be his wife, Wesley said yes, with the quiet, total conviction of a man who has considered the matter thoroughly from every angle and has arrived at a complete answer. Clem shook Wesley's hand afterward with the solemn force of a man expressing a great deal through a handshake. Robert talked at length about his mother's recipe for wedding cake. Francisco presented Ada with a small painted tile from Coahuila depicting 2 blue birds, explaining briefly that it was a traditional gift for a new household, and the brevity of his explanation and the care of the gift moved Ada more than she could properly express. Patsy had made a cake. It was the best cake Ada had ever eaten in her life. That evening, when the small celebration had concluded and the house was theirs again in the early spring dark, Ada stood on the porch with the first real warmth of the year just beginning to thread through the cool night air, and Wesley came out to stand beside her, and they were quiet together in the specific way of people who have chosen each other and know it absolutely. "I want to tell you something," Ada said. "All right," he said. "I was afraid of this," she said, "of caring about someone again. My father, watching what he was able to hide, what he was willing to do and conceal, it made me wonder whether you could ever know anyone, whether any of it was real." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "What changed your mind?" "The margin notes," she said. He made a sound. "You showed me a book with your dead wife's handwriting in the margins," Ada said. "You didn't hide her. You didn't pretend she hadn't existed or that it wasn't hard that she was gone. You just showed me the whole thing, the love and the grief and the humor and all of it, and trusted me to handle it. A man who hides things doesn't do that." He turned to look at her, and in the light from the window his face was everything she had been learning for months, the quiet depth of it, the steadiness, the particular light that appeared in his eyes when he was with her now. "She would have liked you," he said. "Clara, she had no patience for pretension. She would have liked you very much." "I hope so," Ada said. He put his arm around her carefully, the way he did everything, and she leaned into it, and they stood on the porch in the early spring dark until the stars were properly out. The investigation into Gerald Maddox moved through the summer of 1880 with the grinding momentum of federal bureaucracy. Marshal Reardon wrote to Ada twice, formal letters that used careful legal language to tell her that the investigation was progressing, that additional evidence had been found, that her cooperation had been instrumental. In August he wrote to say that Gerald Maddox had been arrested and charged. Ada sat with that letter for a long time. Wesley came home from the eastern pasture to find her at the kitchen table, the letter before her and her face composed in the particular way of a person managing something with considerable effort. He sat down across from her without a word. After a moment she slid the letter to him. He read it. He looked up. "What do you need?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "I don't know whether to grieve or to feel relieved," she said. "He was a terrible thing that he did, but he was also my father. He raised me. Before I knew what he was capable of, I loved him." "Those things can both be true," Wesley said. "I know," she said. "I know they can, it's just," she looked at her hands. "I wanted him to be what he appeared to be. I wanted that version of him to be real." "The love you had for the version you thought was real," Wesley said carefully, "that was real. Your feeling of it was real. That doesn't become a lie just because he was one." Ada looked at him across the kitchen table in the August morning light. This man she had chosen and who had chosen her. This man who had come to a train station with her name on a piece of paper and had looked at her without judgment and had offered to carry something heavy for a while, and thought about all the ways a person can be known, truly and thoroughly known, by another person. She said, "I'm very glad I ended up here." He reached across the table and took her hand. "So am I," he said. Every single day. In September, a new trouble arrived from the East Fence. The Danforth brothers, apparently having decided that Wesley's growing household happiness was a personal affront, escalated their fence dispute to physical action. One morning, Francisco came in white-lipped to report that the east section of fence had been cut again, and 14 head of Hereford cattle were missing. Wesley's expression was very still. He sent Robert to town to fetch Sheriff Drummond and went himself to assess the damage. Ada watched him go from the porch, and then went inside and loaded the revolver she kept in the drawer of the washstand, a single-shot percussion pistol that had been one of her father's early training gifts to her, the only firearm she'd brought from Caldwell, and she handled it with the precise, unsentimental competence of a gunsmith's daughter who had been taught to shoot properly at age 10. She was not going to sit inside this house and wait while the world decided things for her. She was done with that. When Wesley returned 2 hours later with Sheriff Drummond and Clem, Ada was on the porch with the pistol on the rail beside her, calm and present. Drummond, who was a lean, sun-worn man of genuine authority, looked at her and then at the pistol and then back at her. "Mrs. Keating," he said carefully. "Sheriff," she said pleasantly. Wesley looked at her with an expression she had come to love specifically. It was the expression of a man who had been surprised by something and was not sorry about it. Drummond took statements from all the hands, examined the fence, catalogued the missing cattle. He rode to the Danforth property and returned 2 hours later looking satisfied in a grim, professional way. Roy Danforth had made the mistake of still having the Keating ear tags on 2 of the recovered cattle when Drummond arrived. Both Danforth brothers were arrested. The civil case regarding the fence was resolved by the deed survey Wesley's lawyer had filed months earlier. By November, the Danforths had been fined, required to compensate Wesley for his cattle, and formally forbidden from approaching the Keating property line. Holt Danforth, as he was being loaded into Drummond's wagon, looked past the sheriff toward the porch where Ada stood and called out something unpleasant about women and their places. Ada looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has survived considerably worse than the opinion of a small and cowardly man, and said nothing, because nothing was the appropriate amount of response. Wesley, who was standing 3 feet to Holt's left, said one very quiet sentence to him that Ada did not hear. Whatever it was, Holt Danforth said nothing further. She asked Wesley about it later. He shrugged. "I told him that his opinion of my wife is of no more interest to me than a rock's opinion of a river, and that he should use his time in jail to consider whether he has any qualities worth improving." Ada looked at him. "Was that wrong?" he asked. "No," she said, and kissed him for the first time with the specific intention of telling him something with it, rather than just expressing what was already obvious between them. He kissed her back with the same complete, careful attention he applied to everything, and it was, she thought, exactly right. By winter of 1880, the Keating Ranch had its own particular gravity, the kind that a house develops when it is genuinely lived in and genuinely loved. Patsy continued her 3 days a week, and had entirely stopped pretending. She came primarily for the cooking as opposed to for Ada's company. Clem had gone near silent on the subject of Ada, which from Clem meant he approved of her completely. Robert had, after much deliberation, started corresponding with a girl in Abilene, and was undergoing the process with an anxiety that amused everyone around him. Francisco had been given a small raise and a room upgrade, and had responded by working harder than before, which seemed to be his fundamental mode of gratitude. And Ada found herself, on a December morning 1 year after she had arrived on that train platform with her carpet bag and her secrets and her determination not to be crushed, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the cottonwood trees in their winter bareness, and feeling something she wanted to identify precisely. She was happy, not the fragile, handled happiness of someone who is being careful. Not the relief of someone who has survived something terrible and is grateful merely to be standing. Genuinely, robustly, unreservedly happy, with the particular depth of it that comes when happiness is built on truth, on being fully known and fully chosen, and having chosen fully in return. She put a hand to her stomach, where something new was making itself known. She had not told Wesley yet. She had confirmed it with the town doctor, a mild and capable woman named Dr. Eleanor Marsh, who had set up her practice in Harlow Creek 2 years earlier and was regarded by half the town as a miracle, and by the other half with suspicion that was steadily eroding. Dr. Marsh had told Ada what she already suspected, and had given her plain, practical information with the directness of a woman who believed that the facts were better than vagueness. Ada told Wesley that evening after supper. She had thought about how to do it for 3 days, where, when, how. In the end, she simply looked at him across the kitchen table where they had had so many of their most important conversations and said, "We're going to have a child." Wesley set down his coffee cup. He looked at her with an expression that went through several things very quickly: surprise, recognition, something that was wonder with its shoes on, and then he did something she had not seen him do since the early days of their acquaintance. He had to take a moment. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands for just a moment, and when he looked up there was something very open in his expression that she thought he would have guarded a year ago. "Ada," he said. His voice had a different quality to it than usual. "Yes," she said. "I don't have adequate words for this," he said. "That's all right," she said. "I can see it." She could. She could see it completely in his face and his hands and the way he was sitting, and she reached across the table and he took her hand with both of his and held it the way you hold something precious and real. "Are you well?" he asked immediately. "Dr. Marsh says I'm very well," Ada said. "She expects no difficulties." He nodded, visibly working through the emotional weather and arriving at the practical, not because he was suppressing anything, but because he was the kind of man for whom love expressed itself in care. "I'll talk to Francisco about the east fence repair. If the Danforths are dealt with," Ada said. "If anyone else, Wesley," she said with gentle firmness. "I am not fragile, I am pregnant, which is a different condition entirely." He looked at her. "I am also a gunsmith's daughter who loaded a pistol and stood on the porch while you went to count missing cattle," she reminded him. "I will be fine. The child will be fine. You can be concerned without treating me as though I might shatter." A slow smile moved across his face. "You're right," he said. "I know you're right." "Of course I am," she said pleasantly. "Don't be smug about it." "I absolutely will be smug about it," she said, and he laughed fully and entirely, the way she had been coaxing out of him since that first evening with Clara's poetry, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was going, and Ada thought, This is the thing I was traveling toward. All of it, the train and the disgrace and the carpet bag and the empty horizon, all of it was the road to this specific kitchen with this specific man and this specific laugh. The spring of 1881 was gentle, and the lambing and calving went well, and Ada grew steadily and kept the house with the help of Patsy and of Wesley, who had quietly redistributed certain heavy tasks to himself without making any announcement about it, as was his way. She continued to read, working steadily through the bookshelf, annotating in the margins herself now alongside Clara's notes, building a conversation across time with a woman she had never met and found she liked enormously. She wrote to Marshal Reardon in the spring to ask about the status of the case against her father. Reardon's reply arrived in April, a thick envelope with full documentation. Gerald Maddox had been convicted on 3 counts of illegal weapons modification and 2 counts of conspiracy in connection with the supply wagon raids. He had been sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. 2 of his buyers had also been convicted. Ada read the letter on the porch in the April morning, with the ranch coming alive around her in the first warmth of the year. She felt the weight of it, the genuine, complicated grief of a daughter who had loved her father and been betrayed by him. She did not diminish that grief or pretend it was simple. She let it be what it was. And then she set the letter on the porch rail and looked out at the cottonwood trees coming into leaf against the wide Texas sky, and she thought about the railroad station platform in October of 1879, and a man with a piece of paper with her name on it who had looked at her without judgment, and she thought, I am still here. I am more here, in fact, than I have ever been. Whatever he took from me, he did not take this. The baby came in July of 1881, on a hot afternoon while a summer thunderstorm rolled in from the southwest. Dr. Marsh attended, efficient and cheerful, and Patsy was there to be generally useful and emotionally volcanic in the way only Patsy could be, and Wesley was directly outside the bedroom door in a state of focused, entirely suppressed anxiety that Francisco and Clem were managing by keeping him supplied with coffee and conversation about cattle. The baby was a boy. He arrived with an opinion about it, loud and clear, and was placed in Ada's arms while the storm broke overhead, and the rain came down in sheets on the ranch house roof, which made an extraordinary sound. And Ada looked at this new person she had made and thought about the word home, what it meant, how it was made, how it was not a place but a constellation of choices and people, and the particular quality of light in a specific kitchen at a specific hour. Wesley came in when Dr. Marsh gave permission and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the boy in Ada's arms with the expression Ada had come to call his truest face. The one under everything, the one that held all of it at once. He has your eyes, Wesley said. It's too soon to tell, Ada said. He has your eyes, Wesley said again with complete conviction, and Ada decided not to argue because he was probably right. What shall we name him, she asked. They had discussed this but had reached no final agreement, holding the question open the way you hold something you're not sure about but want to be right. Wesley was quiet for a moment. Thomas, he said, if you're amenable, my grandfather. Thomas Keating, Ada said, trying it. The boy seemed indifferent to it, having fallen asleep. And for a second name, Wesley looked at her. Your choice, she thought about it. James, she said, my mother's father. Thomas James Keating, Wesley said. That's a serious name for a person this small, Ada said. He'll grow into it, Wesley said with perfect confidence. She looked at him. Thank you, she said. He looked at her steadily. For what? For coming to the station, she said. For choosing this. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, with the gentleness of a man who has learned that tenderness is not weakness, that the careful attention you bring to the things you love is its own kind of strength. Thank you, he said, for getting on the train. Thomas James Keating proved to be a robust and highly opinionated infant who had Ada's directness and Wesley's patience in equal measure, which created some interesting internal negotiations as he grew. He was walking by the time he was 11 months old, with the determined, slightly precarious conviction of someone who has decided that crawling is beneath his dignity, and he fell down approximately 40 times a day for a week and got up every single time with the expression of a man who does not believe in setbacks as a category. He's yours, Wesley told Ada, watching this process from the porch. He's also yours, Ada said. Notice how he gets up every time. Wesley smiled. Thomas crashed into the porch step, reconsidered, and turned around to investigate a beetle. The ranch continued to prosper. The resolution of the Danforth dispute had made the property's eastern boundary secure, and with that security, Wesley had been able to extend his grazing range and increase his herd. Robert had married his girl from Abilene and brought her to Harlow Creek, and she had turned out to be a calm, funny woman named Alice, who had taken one look at the ranch operation and offered 3 immediately useful improvements to the feed schedule, which had won Francisco's respect within the first week. Patsy eventually reduced to 2 days a week, not because Ada needed her less, but because Patsy's own household had expanded with a visiting grandniece, and Ada managed the kitchen now with the confident mastery of someone who has truly learned a space and made it her own. The books on the shelf continued to accumulate. Wesley had taken to buying them in San Antonio on his quarterly trips, guided by an increasingly specific knowledge of what Ada would and wouldn't like, which knowledge she considered one of the most intimate forms of love. In 1882, a letter arrived from Marshal Reardon that Ada had not expected. It was about the people her father had been selling to the men behind the supply wagon ambushes. 3 of them had been convicted alongside her father. 2 more were in custody awaiting trial. But one, a man named Cole Trask, had apparently made reference in his trial testimony to the Gunsmith's woman in Texas as a potential target for retribution. Reardon's letter was measured and factual. He said federal authorities were monitoring Trask, who was in custody and not in a position to act. He said Ada should inform him of any suspicious approaches or contact. He said this was almost certainly precautionary. Ada showed the letter to Wesley. He read it twice. His expression when he looked up was the very still kind. "I want to write to Reardon," Ada said immediately, "and ask for specifics, what exactly Trask said, what level of threat assessment they've assigned it, whether there are Confederates still at large." "That's exactly what I would have suggested," Wesley said. "I also want to be clear about something," Ada said. "This does not change how we live." He looked at her. "I am not going to be frightened into changing how we live," she said. "I am not going to stop going into town or managing this household or doing anything I do because a man in federal custody said something unspecific in a courtroom. What I am going to do is be informed and be prepared and be sensible." "I agree with all of that," Wesley said quietly. "Good," she said, "because I'll also be keeping the pistol in the kitchen drawer from now on, which it should have been in anyway." "It should have been," he agreed. She wrote to Reardon. His detailed reply came 3 weeks later and confirmed that Trask had spoken in frustration rather than in specific planning, that he had no known Confederates in Texas, and that the remark had been noted and assessed as low risk but worth monitoring. Ada filed the letter with her other Marshal correspondence and got on with her life. Nothing came of it. Cole Trask was convicted in October of 1882 and sentenced to 15 years. Ada received notification from Reardon, thanked him for his continued communication, and felt the last weight of that particular fear lift from her shoulders like a coat she hadn't realized she was still wearing. She told Wesley that evening. "It's done," she said. "All of it." He looked at her across the kitchen, where Thomas was asleep upstairs and the evening was settling over the ranch in shades of amber and rose. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it. "Like I can breathe all the way to the bottom," she said. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she leaned into him the way she had been doing for 2 years now, with the specific ease of a woman who is exactly where she has chosen to be. "I'm proud of you," he said into her hair. "I've been proud of you since that first day on the platform." "I was terrified that first day," she admitted. "I know," he said. "You were also magnificent." She laughed against his shoulder. "You were terrified too," she said. "Don't pretend you weren't." "I was afraid you'd get back on the train," he said. She pulled back enough to look at him. "Why would I have done that?" "Because Harlow Creek is small and the house needed work and I'm not an easy man to know," he said. "And because you had every reason in the world to not trust a stranger's word. You had your name on a piece of paper," she said. "You'd come specifically. You looked at me like I was a person." She reached up and touched his face, the way she'd been learning to do, this face she had memorized. "Those things matter more than they seem like they should." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, briefly, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of eloquence. Thomas turned 2 in July of 1883 and became immediately, dramatically opinionated about the presence of the ranch horses, which he considered his personal property and responsibility. He had to be watched carefully near the paddock, not because he was reckless but because he was convinced, and the horses seemed to find him interesting, which was a dangerous combination. Wesley began teaching him the names of the animals with the patient, detailed attention of a man who believes that being genuinely taught something is one of the highest forms of respect you can offer a small person. Ada watched them sometimes from the porch. Her husband crouched down to her son's level in the paddock dust, explaining something about the chestnut mare with the focused earnestness of a man for whom words are tools rather than ornament, and felt the specific, full warmth of a happiness that had been earned rather than granted. In the fall of 1883, she found herself pregnant again. This time she told Wesley across the porch rail at sunset, because she had been reading out there, and he had come to find her and sit beside her, and it seemed exactly the right moment. He took the news with the same combination of wonder and immediate practical consideration, and then he said after a moment, "Thomas is going to have thoughts about this." "Thomas has thoughts about everything," Ada said. "He's going to want to be involved," Wesley said. "He's 2, Ada said. "He's an extremely 2-year-old too," Wesley said. They both sat with that for a moment, and then Ada started laughing, the real kind, and Wesley followed, and the evening settled over the Keating ranch with the sound of them in it. The second baby arrived in May of 1884. A girl this time, born in the springtime with the bluebonnets coming and the cottonwoods in full leaf. They named her Margaret Clara Margaret for Ada's mother, Clara for Wesley's first wife, because some legacies deserve to be carried forward with love rather than buried with grief. Thomas Keating, aged 2 and 8 months, regarded his sister with the expression of a very senior official reviewing a new and uncertain appointment. Then he held out one small, careful finger and she wrapped her tiny hand around it, and his expression shifted into something that looked remarkably like capitulation, and the matter was settled. "You were right," Ada said to Wesley. "About Thomas. He's involved," she said. "They named it right." Thomas was emphatically, comprehensively involved in Margaret Clara's existence from that day forward, with a protective gravity that made Patsy cry and made Francisco smile and made Robert tell a long story about his own sister that nobody asked for, and that was nonetheless completely appropriate. The years settled into the ranch the way good years do, not as a series of dramatic events, but as an accumulation of ordinary, irreplaceable days. Mornings that smelled of coffee and hay. Evenings on the porch with the last of the light. The sound of children's voices through the house. The particular companionship of two people who know each other thoroughly and have decided, on the basis of that thorough knowledge, that they are exactly right for each other. Ada had a life that was entirely her own. She ran the household with the efficient confidence of someone who has long since stopped trying to prove herself and simply does the work. She wrote letters to Patsy when Patsy finally retired to San Antonio to be near her grandniece, to Robert and Alice who had moved to a claim in New Mexico, to Dr. Marsh who remained in Harlow Creek and became a genuine friend. She read everything she could get hold of. She taught Thomas to read with the same directness she'd applied to everything, sitting with him at the kitchen table every afternoon with a patience born of love. And the morning he read a full sentence without help, she felt a specific, private triumph that she carried for a week. Wesley remained the same in all the essential ways, which was to say he was steady and present and honest and careful with the things that mattered, and the small changes time made in him. The deeper lines around his eyes, the slight silver beginning at his temples, the way he had learned to put his arm around her without it being a decision, were all changes Ada watched with an affection that only deepened. She loved him differently at 5 years than she had at 1, the way a country changes its appearance depending on how far into it you've walked. The essential landscape was the same, but she knew it now, the way you know something you have lived inside rather than simply seen. He loved her in a way that had become its own country. One evening in the autumn of 1886, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret Clara 2, and the ranch was settled, and the fireplace in the parlor was going against the October chill, Ada sat with her feet tucked under her on the chair nearest the lamp, reading, and Wesley came in from the evening check and sat across from her and picked up his own book, and they read in companionable silence as they had done since their first winter together. After a while, Ada looked up. "Wheeze," she said. He looked up the way he always did, immediately and fully, because that was who he was. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I was sent here," she said. "You know that. I was sent here in disgrace with nothing by a father who was trying to get rid of me. I arrived on that platform expecting the worst." He listened. "And what I got," she said, "was you, standing there with my name on a piece of paper, treating me like a person when I had every reason to expect otherwise." She paused. "I want you to know that. I know what it was. I know what you chose when you chose to see me clearly from the beginning." Wesley set his book down. His face had that particular quality she loved best in him, the unguarded one. "Ada," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "I want you to also know that everything I was afraid I'd lost, my name, my dignity, my sense of myself as a person worth something, you didn't restore it. That's important. You didn't restore it because it wasn't yours to restore. I found it again myself. But you gave me the space and the safety to do that, and that is a completely different and more significant thing than restoring it for me." She looked at him steadily. "I love you for that, among many other things." He was very quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I drove to that station, I didn't know who you were going to be. I knew your name and that Harlan said you'd been hard done by and that you were Gerald Maddox's daughter. I didn't know anything else." He paused. "And then you walked across that platform and you looked at me like you were measuring whether I was worth your trust, and you said my name like a question, and I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought, there she is," he said simply. "Whatever this is going to be, there she is." The fire crackled. Somewhere upstairs, the sound of a child shifting in sleep. Ada looked at her husband across the parlor that had been his and Clara's and was now theirs, with the books that held 2 women's margin notes and the cedar tree that went up every Christmas and the particular smell of this house that had become the smell of home, and she thought about the word chosen. She had been sent away. That was true. She had been chosen. That was also true, and it was larger. She got up from her chair and went to sit beside him on the settee, and he put his arm around her without it being a production, the way you do with someone who belongs beside you, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they listened to the fire and the house and the children asleep upstairs and the wide Texas night outside, full and quiet and entirely real. "I'm glad," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." The ranch continued into its seasons. Thomas started school in Harlow Creek in the fall of 1886, walking the 2 miles each way with the particular seriousness of a boy who had decided education was important and intended to treat it accordingly. His teacher, a young woman newly arrived from Missouri named Miss Elliston, wrote Ada a note after the first month to say that Thomas Keating was the most focused student she had encountered in 3 years of teaching, and also that he had spent a significant portion of a history lesson explaining to the class the proper maintenance of a Hereford cattle operation, which had been off-topic but technically accurate. Ada laughed for a long time over that note. Margaret Clara, at 3, was developing the particular combination of charm and implacability that suggested she was going to be entirely herself regardless of anyone's preferences on the matter, which Ada considered entirely correct. She had Wesley's stillness and Ada's directness, and the specific look of a person who has already figured out more than she's letting on. And by the time she was 4, she had the ranch hands organized into a rotation of after-supper storytelling that they all participated in with the slightly bewildered enthusiasm of men who are not entirely sure how they got here but don't want to leave. Clem told Margaret Clara a story about a horse he'd known in his younger days in Arkansas, delivered in his near silence, and she sat through it with absolute attention and then asked him 3 exact and penetrating questions about the horse, and Clem looked at Wesley with an expression that said, "This child is going to be something," and Wesley looked back with an expression that said, "I know, Isn't it remarkable? In 1887, Patsy Greer came back from San Antonio for a week's visit and spent most of it in the kitchen with Ada, talking with the full and particular richness of two women who have built a genuine friendship over years and don't need to account for the time between meetings. She had grown rounder and more cheerful in retirement and had opinions about the state of the world that she delivered with undiminished conviction. "You're different than you were," Patsy told Ada on the last evening of the visit over tea on the porch. "How so?" Ada asked. "You came here carrying something," Patsy said. "I could see it from the first. Not just the trouble with your father, something deeper, like you'd been told by the world or by someone in it that you had to earn the right to take up space." Ada was quiet for a moment. "You don't carry that anymore," Patsy said. "You walk around this house like it's yours, which it is. You walk around your own life like it's yours, which it also is, and that's—" She paused. "That didn't come from Wesley, by the way. I know him well enough to say that. He loved you into safety, but he didn't give you that. You got there yourself." Ada thought of something Wesley had said, that she had found herself rather than being restored, and thought that these two people had seen the same thing from different angles. "I had a good year," Ada said. "October of 1879. One year that started with everything falling apart and ended with everything falling together. It doesn't seem like enough time for that much to change." "It's enough time for the important things," Patsy said comfortably. "The important things don't need much time. They just need the right place." Ada looked out at the cottonwood trees in the evening light, at the porch chairs angled toward each other in their permanent mid-conversation, at the wide Texas sky going gold and amber above the flat horizon, at the lamplight beginning to show through the kitchen window where Wesley was reading to the children before bed, his voice low and steady through the walls. "I'm home," Ada said. Not as a statement requiring comment, but simply as an acknowledgement of what was true. "Yes," Patsy said, "you are. There was one more thing, and it happened in the spring of 1888. A letter arrived from Leavenworth, Kansas, from Gerald Maddox. It was short. He had written 3 separate times and thrown the letters away. That much was evident in the roughness of the surviving prose. He said he was not writing to ask for anything. He said he was writing because he had thought about what he had done, what specifically he had done to her, and he found he could not write, whatever it cost him. He said he was sorry, not for being caught, for what he was, for the thing he had been behind the clean shop window, for sending her away. He said he hoped she was all right." Ada sat with the letter for 3 days. On the 4th day she wrote back. She wrote 2 pages, plain and honest, the way she wrote everything now. She told him she was well and married and had 2 children. She told him that what he had done had hurt her, and that she had not forgiven it yet and might not fully. She told him that she had reported him because people were being hurt, and it needed to stop, and she would make the same choice again. She told him she hoped he used whatever years he had left to become someone who deserved the respect he had once worn as a performance. And at the end, because it was true, she wrote, "I know you loved me in whatever broken way you were able. I am choosing not to let that love be canceled by what came after. It was real. I carry it carefully." She did not sign it, "Your loving daughter." She signed it, "Ada Keating." She showed the letter to Wesley before she sent it. He read it and then looked at her with the full, quiet attention she had been learning since October of 1879. "Is it right?" she asked. "It's exactly right," he said. She sent it. Gerald Maddox wrote back once more, a shorter letter with fewer cross-outs. He said thank you. He said she was her mother's daughter. He said he was glad she had found somewhere real. Ada filed both letters with the Marshall correspondence, in the box she kept in the top of the wardrobe. Archived rather than destroyed. Real rather than erased. She went downstairs and made supper and called Wesley and the children in from the yard. And Thomas came in with a detailed report about the condition of the east fence that he had personally inspected. And Margaret Clara came in with a lizard in her pocket that she had named Hector and intended to keep. And Wesley came in last, stopping to wash at the pump, and looked across the kitchen at Ada with the specific look that was only ever for her, the one that said, "This This right here. This is the whole thing. Wash up, Ada told everyone. Supper's hot. Thomas corralled his sister toward the wash basin. Hector the lizard was introduced to the outdoors after some negotiation. Wesley came to stand beside Ada at the stove, and she leaned into him for just a moment, the way she always did, the way she had always done from the very first time. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said. "Everything's right." The ranch sat in the spring evening with the cottonwoods full and green, and the kitchen windows lit warm against the coming dark. And inside it 2 children washed their hands and argued about lizards, and the supper was hot, and the books on the shelf held 2 women's handwriting in the margins, and the porch chairs sat angled toward each other as they always had. Ada Keating stood at the stove of her own kitchen in her own house in the wide Texas country, and the woman who had stepped off a train in disgrace with nothing but her secrets and her dignity and a single carpetbag was still there inside her, intact and real and no longer afraid. She had been sent away. She had been chosen anyway. And she had chosen too, fully and freely and without reservation, the life and the man and the place that had turned out to be exactly, precisely, irreversibly hers. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.